Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really embarking on a crucial journey through American history. We're diving into Eric Foner's Chapter 14, The Civil War, 1861-1865, A New Birth of Freedom.
Hmm.
Our mission is to understand how this huge conflict didn't just preserve a union, but profoundly transform the very definition of freedom in America.
That's exactly right. This chapter really helps us see the Civil War as this crucible, forging a new nation with a completely new understanding of liberty.
Yeah.
And you'll see how deeply personal experiences mirrored this national evolution. Like, take Marcus M. Spiegel. He was a Jewish immigrant from Germany.
Okay.
He started out as a really staunch Union supporter, but not an abolitionist, not at all. Yet, after seeing the sheer brutality of slavery firsthand down south, his views just shifted dramatically.
Wow.
Yeah, his story is a powerful illustration of the profound changes in perspective that really define this era.
So let's unpack not just the events, but the deeper meaning of this new birth of freedom and, well, why it still shapes us today. Okay, so when we talk about the Civil War, you hear historians call it the first modern war. What does that truly mean? How should we understand that?
Well, what's striking is the sheer scale and the technological innovation. This just wasn't warfare as America had ever known it before.
Right.
You saw mass armies, we're talking millions of men confronting each other with weapons basically forged in the Industrial Revolution. And the casualty numbers, they're just staggering.
Yeah, I mean, 750,000 deaths.
Roughly, yeah. And to put that in perspective, that's more than all previous American wars combined. It's like over 7 million lives in today's population terms.
Unbelievable.
It really is. It fundamentally shifted things from just armies fighting armies to, well, entire societies mobilizing for total war.
And the technology wasn't just on the battlefield, right? It touched everything.
Absolutely. Think about the railroad. Suddenly you could move troops and supplies on a massive scale, making strategic locations like Atlanta absolutely vital. And naval warfare totally revolutionized by ironclads. The Union's Monitor and the Confederate Merrimack, that battle basically proved wooden ships were obsolete overnight.
Right.
And then you had the telegraph for rapid military communication, observation balloons, even, primitive hand grenades and submarines starting to appear.
Wow. But Foner really highlights the rifle, doesn't he? What was it about the rifle that had such a profound impact?
Oh, the rifle changed everything about combat. It was accurate from like 600 yards or more. Before that, you had smoothbore muskets with a much shorter effective range.
So soldiers were vulnerable much sooner.
Exactly. Advancing lines of soldiers were just cut down long before they could even engage hand-to-hand. This led directly to a reliance on heavy fortifications, elaborate trenches. It often favored defensive forces, especially, the Southern armies initially.
And that directly fed into those horrifying casualty numbers we mentioned.
Directly. It was a clash of new technology against often older tactics. Brutal.
And beyond the battlefield itself, how did these modern elements, like, bring the war home for average Americans?
Well, for the first time, the war's realities were incredibly immediate. There was this unprecedented propaganda effort. Sure, lithographs, pamphlets, souvenirs.
Right.
But crucially, you had war correspondents reporting on battles practically the next day, publishing these long, long casualty lists.
Oh, wow.
And then there's photography. Suddenly you have these graphic images of death and destruction showing up, brought right into American homes. It made the conflict absolutely impossible to ignore.
So as this modern war kicks off, how did the two sides actually stack up? Resources, strategy.
Well, on paper, initial comparisons heavily favored the Union. The North and the loyal border states, they had about 22 million people. The Confederacy, 9 million, and remember, 3.5 million of those were enslaved people.
Huge difference.
Massive.
Yeah.
And the North just vastly outstripped the South in manufacturing, railroad mileage, financial resources, pretty much everything.
But it wasn't that simple, was it?
No, because the Union had this incredibly daunting task to invade and conquer an area bigger than Western Europe. And Confederate soldiers, they were fighting with fierce motivation, defending their homes, their way of life.
And both sides started with patriotic volunteers.
Yeah, initially fueled by this powerful patriotism on both sides.
Yeah.
But that enthusiasm, it waned pretty quickly under the reality of war. Both sides had to resort to a draft.
So what were the initial military game plans?
The Confederacy, mostly under General Robert E. Lee, adopted a largely defensive strategy. The hope was to wear down the Union's resolve, maybe with occasional thrusts north.
Okay.
Lincoln's early generals, particularly George B. McClellan, were very focused on capturing Richmond, the Confederate capital. That seemed like the obvious target.
But Lincoln saw things differently.
He soon realized that just occupying territory wouldn't win the war. The real objective had to be defeating the South's armies in the field, destroying their capacity to fight.
Those early battles, though, they were a brutal wake-up call, especially for the Union in the East, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. The First Battle of Bull Run, July 1861, it ended in this chaotic Union retreat, shattered any illusions of a quick, easy war. It showed everyone the sheer scale of what was unfolding.
And McClellan, he was cautious.
Very cautious. Great organizer, the Army of the Potomac, but reluctant to commit to battle. Then you get the 7 Days Campaign, Lee forces him back. Second Bull Run, another Lee victory.
But then came Antietam.
Antietam, September 1862, Lee's first invasion of the North repelled. But the cost. It's still the single deadliest day in U.S. history. About 4,000 killed, 18,000 wounded in one day.
Horrific, but strategically vital.
Hugely vital. It halted Lee, yes, but crucially it gave Lincoln the military window, the sort of victory he felt he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation.
And while the East was this bloody stalemate, often the West was seeing different results.
Yeah, the West is where Ulysses S. Grant really starts to emerge. After, a string of failures in civilian life, Grant quickly showed this daring, this strategic grasp.
Like with Forts Henry and Donelson.
Exactly. February 62, he captures Forts Henry and Donelson in Tennessee. Big deal. First significant Union victories opened up key rivers.
And New Orleans fell too, right?
Yeah. Naval forces took New Orleans in April 62. Huge blow to the Confederacy, losing their largest city. And Grant, even though he was surprised at Shiloh, he held on. These were crucial early successes for the Union in the West.
Okay, so it's clear the war started to preserve the Union. We've established that. But how did it become a war to end slavery? That's such a profound shift, especially given Lincoln's initial position.
It really is. And Lincoln initially insisted slavery was, well, irrelevant to the conflict. His main concern politically was keeping those 4 border slave states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, in the Union.
Couldn't afford to lose them.
Absolutely not, and he needed broad Northern support. Congress even passed the Crittenden Resolution early on, basically saying, hey, we're just fighting to save the Union, not messing with slavery. Union commanders were even returning fugitive slaves initially.
But that policy just couldn't hold, could it? What started to unravel it?
Well, a few things. The Confederacy was obviously using enslaved people for military labor, building fortifications, transporting goods. That made them a military asset.
Right.
But even more powerfully, enslaved people themselves played a crucial role. Thousands of black men, women, and children started escaping to Union lines. This created a real dilemma.
The contraband policy.
Exactly. General Benjamin F. Butler down in Virginia started calling them contraband of war. Basically, enemy property subject to confiscation.
So not freeing them, but confiscating them.
Kind of. But these contrabands were housed in camps. They received education in new schools. It visibly started shifting the perception of their status. They weren't just property anymore in the eyes of many Union soldiers and officers.
So the enslaved people themselves were really pushing the boundaries of freedom.
They absolutely were. Black people, both North and South, started calling it the Freedom War long before Lincoln or the government did.
Really?
Yeah. Their mass exodus to Union lines, often bringing vital military intelligence, was this undeniable demonstration of their desire for liberty. Foner mentions a reporter in Louisiana noting that their actions, sacking plantations, leaving en masse, meant slavery was forever destroyed and worthless, no matter what Mr. Lincoln or anyone else may say.
Wow. So their actions were forcing the Union's hand, in a way.
It's definitely forcing the issue. And this pressure, combined with, frankly, military setbacks for the Union, started pushing Congress and eventually Lincoln towards emancipation.
Who was pushing hardest?
Well, you had staunch abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and radical Republicans in Congress eloquently arguing that emancipation had to be a war aim.
And Congress started listening.
Yes, frustrated by the lack of military progress. In March 62, they prohibited the Army from returning fugitive slaves. Then they abolished slavery in D.C. with compensation, interestingly, and in the federal territories.
Okay.
Then came the Second Confiscation Act in July 62. This was a big step. It liberated slaves of disloyal owners and any slaves who managed to escape to Union lines.
And Lincoln's thinking was evolving too. He wasn't initially for immediate abolition.
No, he initially favored gradual, compensated emancipation, and he even explored the idea of colonization sending freed slaves abroad. But by the summer of 1862, he came to see emancipation as a political and, crucially, a military necessity.
How so militarily?
It would address manpower shortages by allowing black men to enlist. It would strike at the heart of the Confederacy's economy and social structure. Plus, it would likely sway public opinion in the North and prevent Britain, which strongly opposed slavery, from supporting the Confederacy.
And all this leads up to the historic Emancipation Proclamation.
Right. After that bloody victory at Antietam gave him the opening he wanted, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862.
The warning shot.
Basically, yeah. It warned the Confederate states, lay down your arms by the end of the year or face abolition. They didn't, of course. So on January 1st, 1863, he signed the final Emancipation Proclamation.
Now, it's really important to understand exactly what it did and didn't do.
Absolutely crucial. It declared that over 3 million enslaved people in the rebellious states henceforward shall be free.
In the rebellious states.
Yes. Because its legal justification came from Lincoln's power as commander-in-chief in wartime, it applied only to areas not currently under Union control. So it explicitly exempted the loyal border states and also areas of the Confederacy already occupied by Union troops, like parts of Louisiana and Tennessee.
So it didn't instantly free all enslaved people on January 1st, 1863.
No, it didn't. But it fundamentally changed the war's purpose. It transformed the Union Army, wherever it marched in the Confederacy, into an agent of liberation.
That's a huge shift.
Monumental. It welded the goals of Union and abolition together. And it committed the government to enlisting black soldiers, which was incredibly radical at the time. Lincoln himself later said he'd be damned in time and eternity if he ever took it back.
And unlike many other emancipations in the Americas, this was immediate, mostly without compensation for slaveholders.
Exactly. A radical act born of wartime necessity, but with profound long-term consequences.
What was the impact, then, of black soldiers finally being allowed into the Union Army? That must have been controversial.
Hugely controversial initially. The Union refused black volunteers at first, worried about the reaction from white soldiers and, of course, the border states.
But that changed.
It did. By the end of the war, over 180,000 black men had served in the Union Army and another 24,000 in the Navy. Their contribution was immense. About a third of them died in service.
And units like the 54th Massachusetts became famous.
Yes, the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers. Their famous, brave, though ultimately failed, assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina did a lot to dispel doubts about the capabilities and courage of black soldiers.
And for the soldiers themselves.
It was a profoundly liberating experience for many. They were fighting for their own freedom, their family's freedom. Many former soldiers became important leaders during the Reconstruction era that followed the war.
But they didn't get equal treatment, did they?
No, definitely not. They served in segregated units, usually under white officers. They initially received lower pay than white soldiers. They were often assigned disproportionately to labor duties rather than combat. And they faced horrific brutality if captured, like the Fort Pillow Massacre in Tennessee, where Confederate troops killed black soldiers who had surrendered.
Harold.
Despite all that, their contribution was crucial. It also pushed the thinking of many Republicans, and even Lincoln himself. By 1864, Lincoln, for the very first time, publicly called for limited black suffrage specifically for soldiers in reconstructed Louisiana.
So the war experience itself was changing ideas about citizenship and rights.
Absolutely. The battlefield became a proving ground for citizenship, in a way.
Okay, so the war's purpose shifted. Black soldiers joined the fight. Foner talks about this as a Second American Revolution. What does that mean for how we understand liberty and the nation itself during this period?
Yeah, that term really captures the depth of the transformation. Lincoln himself, in 1864, really nailed the ideological divide. He said, we all declare for liberty, but what did that mean?
Right.
For Northerners, increasingly, it meant each man enjoying the product of his labor. For white Southerners, it meant mastership, the freedom to do as they please with other men, and the product of other men's labor.
Two totally different definitions of freedom.
Completely incompatible. And the Union's victory essentially solidified that Northern vision of free labor, individual liberty as the national norm. This whole era, Foner points out, was part of a global process of nation building.
But Lincoln saw America as unique.
Yes, he argued it wasn't just based on a shared ethnicity or territory, but founded on universal ideas: political democracy, human liberty. That's the core of the Gettysburg Address, right? Talking about new birth of freedom and government of the people, by the people, for the people.
And even the language shifted. You mentioned the use of nation.
Exactly. It's subtle but significant. Lincoln used Union 20 times in his first inaugural address in 1861, by the Gettysburg Address in 1863. He uses nation 5 times and Union 0 times.
Wow.
It reflects how the war itself was forging this new national self-consciousness, a more unified political entity rather than just a federation of states.
And how did the war physically transform the economy and build a stronger, more centralized nation state?
Well, the power and responsibilities of the federal government just exploded. The North's economy, unlike the devastated South, actually boomed in many ways due to wartime inflation and massive government contracts. It accelerated mechanization in industries like textiles, meatpacking.
And agriculture. The Homestead Act.
Right, agriculture also flourished. The Homestead Act in January 1863 was huge, offering 160 acres of free public land out west. That fulfilled a certain vision of freedom for many settlers. And the Morrill Land Grant College Act helped establish agricultural and mechanical colleges, investing in human capital.
And the infrastructure saw a massive federal investment, too, especially the railroad.
Oh, definitely. Congress made these huge land and money grants for internal improvements. The most famous, obviously, is the Transcontinental Railroad.
Chartered during the war.
Chartered in 1862, the Union Pacific and Central Pacific employed around 20,000 men to build it. Many were immigrant laborers, including, significantly, many Chinese contract laborers, often called coolies back then, a derogatory term, who faced incredibly dangerous conditions and high death rates, especially blasting through the Sierra Nevada.
And its completion.
Completed in 1869, just after the war. It drastically cut cross-country travel time, knit the national market together, but tragically, as Foner notes, it also really heralded the doom of the Plains Indians and their way of life.
Speaking of the West, the war wasn't just back east. What was happening out west while federal attention was elsewhere.
Yeah, the war deeply affected the West. Communities in places like Missouri, Kansas, Indian Territory were bitterly divided. There was even a Confederate invasion of New Mexico from Texas in '61, hoping to expand slavery westward. They were defeated at Glorieta Pass in '62.
But the bigger impact was on Native Americans.
Tragically, yes. When Lincoln pulled federal troops east to protect Washington, it left settlers and Native Americans in much closer, often more hostile contact. This led to increased violence.
Like in Minnesota.
Right. The Sioux Uprising in Minnesota in '62, where hundreds of white settlers were killed. That led to mass trials and the largest official execution in U.S. history. 38 Dakota men hanged in December '62.
In Sand Creek.
The horrific Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado in 1864. Colorado militiamen attacked a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho camp, mostly women, children, and the elderly, killing over 150. Just brutal.
And the Navajo.
The Navajo's Long Walk, a forced removal of 8,000 people to a reservation. Hundreds died along the way. Even tribes like the Cherokee, who actually owned slaves and sided with the Confederacy, faced punishment after the war, forced land cessions, forced citizenship for their former slaves. It was a period of immense upheaval and often tragedy for Native peoples.
It's staggering. How on earth did the Union pay for all this? The war, the railroad, everything.
Yeah, the sheer cost forced a revolution in financial policy. The government jacked up tariffs, imposed new taxes, including the nation's first income tax. Can you believe it?
Wow.
They borrowed over $2 billion by selling government bonds to the public and banks, creating this massive national debt. And they printed over $400 million in paper money, not backed by gold or silver, those famous greenbacks.
And created a national banking system.
Yep. Congress established a system of nationally chartered banks, required them to buy government bonds, and issued uniform national currency. This whole period also saw the rise of what they're called captains of industry, guys like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, creating or consolidating huge fortunes during the war, often while avoiding military service themselves by paying for substitutes.
Right, that loophole.
Yeah. The federal budget by 1865 was over $1 billion. That's nearly 20 times what it was in 1860. This permanently expanded the size and scope of the federal government.
Amidst all this, what new opportunities, if any, opened up for women, particularly in the North?
While the wartime labor shortage was significant, it allowed Northern women to move into jobs previously dominated by men, factory work, certainly nursing, which became much more professionalized, and even government clerkships in Washington.
Creating lasting change.
Yes, it created permanent places for women in the workforce even after the war. And beyond paid work, hundreds of thousands of women volunteered. The U.S. Sanitary Commission is a key example, coordinating aid for sick and wounded soldiers, raising huge amounts of money through sanitary fairs.
Right, those fairs were a big deal.
Huge. This brought many women into the public sphere in new ways. It fostered a sense of independence, organizational skills, and it definitely nurtured future leaders of the women's rights movement. Think of Clara Barton, who worked tirelessly as a battlefield nurse and later founded the American Red Cross. But, while this national crisis spurred some social changes, it also really exposed deep divisions, even within the North itself.
That's a really important point. It wasn't all unity on the Union side. There was significant opposition, right?
Oh, absolutely. Those who opposed the war, often found in areas with Southern-born populations or among working-class Catholic immigrants, were labeled copperheads by Republicans, basically, seen as traitors.
And the draft was hugely unpopular.
Hugely. Especially the part of the law that allowed wealthier men to hire a substitute or just pay a fee to avoid service. That caused widespread indignation. Rich man's war, poor man's fight was a common sentiment.
Economic resentment.
Yeah, workers resented manufacturers and financiers who seemed to be profiting handsomely from the war while their own real incomes often dwindled due to inflation.
Adding race to that mix.
That created an explosive situation. The prospect of black emancipation, of competition for jobs, sparked this vicious racist backlash in some areas. The most horrific example was the New York City draft riots in July 1863.
What happened there?
For 4 days, mobs, largely composed of Irish immigrants, attacked draft offices, the homes of wealthy Republicans, industrial establishments, and brutally, the city's black population. Lynching victims, burning the colored orphan asylum. Just horrific violence. Over 100 people died before Union troops, fresh from Gettysburg, were brought in to quell the riots.
A stark reminder of the deep divisions. So while the North is grappling with all these changes and tensions, what's life like inside the Confederacy?
Well, the Confederacy faced immense internal turmoil. Jefferson Davis, their president, he was intelligent but often lacked political flexibility and, frankly, the common touch that Lincoln had.
Did the Confederate government centralize power too?
It did, out of necessity. It created armies from scratch, built factories, confiscated resources. But it struggled. Their big diplomatic gamble, the King Cotton diplomacy.
Trying to force Britain and France to intervene by withholding cotton.
Exactly. It failed. Britain needed northern wheat just as much and found other cotton sources in Egypt and India. Ironically, this pushed other countries to expand cotton production, leading to a worldwide glut and price crash after the war, which hurt the South even more.
And internally, similar resentments over the draft.
Oh, yes. The Confederate draft also had exemptions, most notoriously the 20 Negro rule, which exempted one white man on plantations with 20 or more slaves. This fueled enormous class resentment, reinforcing that rich man's war, poor man's fight feeling among poor white Southerners.
And the economic problems just got worse and worse.
Unbelievably bad. The Union blockade became increasingly effective. Union occupation disrupted farming. Slave production declined as many slaves fled or refused to work. This led to acute shortages of basically everything: salt, corn, meat.
How they pay for the war?
Poorly. The Confederate Congress was dominated by planters who were reluctant to tax themselves, especially their slave property. So, like the Union, they borrowed, but mostly they just printed money. About $1.5 billion in paper money.
Leading to runaway inflation.
Rampant inflation. Prices skyrocketed. The government also resorted to impressment, just seizing farm goods to feed the army. This was hugely unpopular and led to food riots in cities like Richmond, mostly led by women demanding bread.
And desertion became a major problem.
Huge. By the war's end, Foner estimates over 100,000 men had deserted the Confederate armies, mostly poor non-slaveholders whose families were starving back home. Loyalty was fraying badly.
Even to the point of considering arming slaves.
Yeah, think about how desperate things had become. By late in the war, the Confederate leadership actually debated, and in March 1865, finally authorized arming slaves to fight for the Confederacy with the promise of freedom. It never really happened on any scale before the war ended, but the very fact they considered it shows how the war was undermining the absolute bedrock of their ideology.
As that planter Howell Cobb supposedly said.
Right. If slaves make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong. The war was forcing them to confront the internal contradictions of their own system.
And Southern women, they also faced new burdens, similar to the North, but maybe even more extreme.
Absolutely. With so many men away fighting, women were forced to manage farms and plantations, roles previously considered strictly male. They had to discipline slaves, run businesses. Non-slave-holding white women also stepped up, working in factories but also mobilizing politically, flooding government offices with petitions demanding assistance as their families suffered.
Their loyalty was strong initially, but
Legendary, yes. Southern women's devotion to the cause was legendary, but as the death toll mounted, as hardship increased, disaffection grew among women too. Their letters urging husbands and sons to come home contributed to declining morale and that high desertion rate.
okay, so both sides are facing internal turmoil. The Confederacy is really struggling, but the war still seemed undecided for a long time. What were the key military turning points that finally shifted the momentum decisively towards the Union?
The summer of 1863, that was really it. Two critical Union victories, almost simultaneous.
Gettysburg.
Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, early July. Lee, after a victory at Chancellorsville, where he unfortunately lost his key general, Stonewall Jackson decided to gamble on another big invasion of the North. He met the Union Army at Gettysburg.
The biggest battle ever on the continent.
Largest battle ever fought in North America. 3 days of brutal fighting. It culminated on July 3rd with Lee's disastrous Pickett's charge against the Union Center. Just absolute carnage. Most of the attacking force was wiped out. Lee was forced to retreat. He'd never again set foot on Northern soil with his army.
And at the exact same time, out west,
Grant was laying siege to Vicksburg, Mississippi. This was the last major Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. Capturing it was absolutely crucial to controlling the river and splitting the Confederacy.
and it fell.
On July 4th, 1863, the day after Pickett's charge was repulsed, Vicksburg surrendered to Grant. This gave the Union complete control of the entire Mississippi Valley. Cut the Confederacy in two. Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana were largely isolated.
So Gettysburg and Vicksburg, back to back.
Yeah.
Devastating for the Confederacy.
Absolutely devastating blows. Really turned the tide.
But even after those huge wins, the war still dragged on for almost 2 more very bloody years. How did the Union finally press its advantage and bring the war to an end?
Well, in 1864, Lincoln brings Grant east to take overall command and confront Lee directly in Virginia. Grant understood the grim math of the war.
The war of attrition.
Exactly, a brutal war of attrition. Grant knew the North could replace its casualties, men and material, while the South increasingly could not. So he adopted this relentless strategy. Attack, attack, attack. Keep hammering Lee's army.
And the cost was enormous.
Horrendous. In about 6 weeks of fighting in the spring of 1864, battles like the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, Grant lost something like 60,000 men. Lee lost 30,000. The casualty rates were approaching World War I levels. Critics in the North called Grant a butcher.
But he kept pushing.
He kept the initiative. He knew Lee couldn't sustain those losses.
And meanwhile, General Sherman was making his famous advance in Georgia.
Precisely. While Grant pinned Lee down in Virginia, General William T. Sherman moved his army south into Georgia. His goal was Atlanta, a major railroad hub and industrial center.
And capturing Atlanta was key.
Hugely important, especially politically. Sherman finally seized Atlanta in September 1864. This victory provided a massive boost to Northern morale, which had been sagging badly under the weight of Grant's casualties. Lincoln himself had seriously doubted he could win re-election that fall.
So Atlanta helps Lincoln win the 1864 election.
It was a major factor, yes. Lincoln faced challenges even from radical Republicans who nominated John C. Fremont briefly. The Democrats nominated his former top general, George B. McClellan.
Awkward.
Very. McClellan ran on a platform calling for an immediate ceasefire and negotiations, which many Republicans saw as basically surrendering or acknowledging Confederate independence. But buoyed by Sherman's capture of Atlanta, Lincoln won a sweeping victory. He carried every state except Kentucky, Delaware, and New Jersey.
And that victory sealed the Confederacy's fate.
Pretty much. It ensured the war would continue until the Confederacy was defeated. There would be no negotiated peace that left slavery intact or the Union divided.
So with Lincoln reelected, the endgame begins. Sherman's march.
Yes. In November 1864, Sherman began his devastating march to the sea. He cut his army loose from its supply lines and marched from Atlanta to Savannah, carving a 60-mile-wide path of destruction through the heart of Georgia.
Targeting civilian resources.
Exactly. Destroying railroads, buildings, food supplies, livestock, anything that could support the Confederate war effort. It was modern war in its total destructiveness, aimed at destroying not just armies, but the enemy's will to fight.
And then came the 13th Amendment.
Right. As the war was clearly winding down, on January 31st, 1865, Congress approved the 13th Amendment. This was monumental. It abolished slavery throughout the entire Union, including the border states, with no compensation. It finally, explicitly put the word slavery into the Constitution to ban it forever.
And Lincoln's tone in his second inaugural.
Yeah, March 1865. It's remarkable. He famously calls for reconciliation, with malice toward none, with charity for all, but he also delivers this really harsh judgment on the nation's past, suggesting the entire war, with all its suffering, was like divine punishment for the terrible sin of slavery shared by both North and South.
Powerful words. And then the final collapse.
April 1865. It happened quickly. Grant finally broke through Lee's lines at Petersburg, the city defending Richmond. That led directly to the fall of Richmond, the Confederate capital, which had been the Union target for 4 long years.
And Lee surrendered.
On April 9th, 1865, Lee surrendered his army to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Grant gave generous terms, allowing the soldiers to keep their horses and return home. While some fighting continued elsewhere for a few weeks, Appomattox effectively ended the Civil War.
But Lincoln, the architect of so much of this, didn't live to see the full peace.
Tragically, no. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, on April 14th, Good Friday, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a pro-Confederate actor at Ford's Theater in Washington.
Just days after giving a speech supporting black suffrage.
Yes, his last public speech, where he called for limited black suffrage in Louisiana. His assassination was part of a larger conspiracy, though the other attacks failed. His funeral train journey back to Illinois became this massive public outpouring of grief across the North, really underscoring how the railroad now bound those northern states together in a new way. Connecting this to the bigger picture, the Civil War just profoundly altered America's standing in the world. Foner mentions Ulysses S. Grant touring the globe after his presidency. He wasn't just seen as a military commander, he was hailed as a hero of freedom, someone who had saved democracy, a nation builder on par with figures like Bismarck in Germany.
So wrapping this all up, what does this deep dive into Foner's chapter tell us? What are the big takeaways for understanding modern America?
Well, it shows us that the Civil War really did lay the foundation. It permanently guaranteed the Union's existence. Secession was dead. It utterly destroyed slavery, the dominant institution of the Old South, and it decisively shifted power from those Southern planters to Northern capitalists.
And the role of government changed forever.
Drastically increased the power and scope of the federal government, and it accelerated the modernization of the economy, the rise of industrial America. But, this raises that crucial question Foner highlights, echoing Frederick Douglass. Destroying slavery was essential, but the work didn't end there. As Douglass said, it only begins.
Right.
The war threw the monumental challenge of defining what African American freedom actually meant and how to protect it squarely onto the post-war agenda. That's the challenge of Reconstruction, and you could argue a challenge that continues to resonate throughout American history.
And there's that powerful paradox. Foner ends with both sides lost something they went to war to defend.
Exactly. The South obviously lost slavery, its economic and social cornerstone. But the North's cherished world, that pre-war ideal of free labor, small shops, independent farmers that was also rapidly being transformed, overwhelmed by the rise of the industrial giant the war helped create.
As the abolitionist Wendell Phillips put it.
Yeah, Americans would never again see the republic in which we were born. The war had changed everything. It truly was a crucible. Forged a new nation, redefined liberty, but absolutely left this enduring legacy of challenges and questions that continue to shape who we are today.
So much to think about there. What stands out to you about this incredible and often brutal transformation of America? We really hope this deep dive has given you a clearer, richer understanding of this absolutely pivotal chapter in American history. Thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We look forward to exploring more fascinating topics with you next time.